Voy a presentar a la siguiente interviniente, Margaret Rhodes. Perdón, Elizabeth Rhodes, estoy llamando Margaret. Es la heraldo escocesa. Empezó a trabajar en la corte del Lord Lyon en 1975 y fue nombrada secretaria del Lyon y guardiana de los registros en 1986, hasta su retirada en 2018. Fue la primera mujer oficial de armas de Escocia. Fue nombrada Carrick Pursuivant en 1992 y posteriormente ascendió a Snowdon Heralden en 2010. Fue secretaria de la Orden del Cardo en 2014 y se retiró como empleada del Lyon y guardiana de los registros en julio de 2018. Es vicepresidente de la Sociedad Heráldica de Escocia, vicepresidente del Consejo Escocés de Archivos, miembro del Consejo y expresidente del Scottish Record Association, presidente de Leones y Cardos, una exposición que fue montada por la Sociedad Heráldica de Escocia en 1995. Miembro de la Sociedad Heráldica de Escocia, como he dicho, de la Real Sociedad Heráldica de Canadá, de la Sociedad Heráldica de Nueva Zelanda, de la Junta de la Académie Internationale d'Heraldique, presidente de la Mesa Permanente de los Congresos Internacionales de Ciencias Genealógica y Heráldica, es decano electo del gremio de Stirling Fiduciario y del Museo Blackwatch. Ha publicado numerosas obras, muchos artículos en revistas de heráldica y conferencias. Hoy nos va a hablar The Coronets and Arms of Scottish Nobility as displayed in Scottish Armorials. Gracias, Elizabeth.
It's not working.
Es un monedero, eso es un llavero, un monedero. Estaba aquí, ¿qué ha pasado con él? ¿Por qué os lleváis el micrófono este?
Es que está sin batería. Hola, sí.
Sí. You can hear me? Thank you very much, Manuel, and for inviting me again. And I have translated the captions on my slides into Spanish. If it's bad Spanish, please forgive me. It will be bad Spanish. This talk is really an overview looking at the types of crowns and coronets used in Scottish armorials from the 16th century up until the present time, and to show how they developed, changed, or were adapted to both time and medium of material. In looking at coronets, we shall also see how artists from different periods treated the arms of the nobility of Scotland. Whilst we do not have the wealth of heraldic material that other countries have, particularly our colleagues south of the border between Scotland and England, we do have some very good examples of how crowns and coronets were used. I have quite deliberately not looked back before 1500 for a variety of reasons, not least that in Scotland, most of our heraldic material from that period is taken from seals, largely because our nice neighbours south of the border took away all our manuscripts at one stage, and when they were returned to Scotland, unfortunately the ship sank. These are two armorials from the 16th century, both which show imaginary pictures of Scottish monarchs. King Fergus I on the right is entirely mythical. And even if he had lived in 330 BC, he did so long before the dawn of heraldry and would not have had an armorial banner. Note, however, the similarity between the crowns on the two kings of David I and his English wife and King Fergus I. And clearly, the artist at the end of the 16th century was using material from earlier in the 16th century to draw his crown. I have to say it's rather like the sort of crown a child would draw rather than one that actually existed. And the crown on the extreme left for the King of Cyprus is not intended to be specific to the King of Cyprus. It is a crown that was used in armorials for the kings of all the nations. These two renderings of the royal arms on right and left apply to King James VI of Scotland. King James VI of Scotland became king on the abdication of his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, in 1567, and in 1603 he succeeded to the crown of England, and therefore it is really Scots who are on the English throne, not English people. The image on the left is very firmly grounded in what we would take to be the right arms for a King of Scots. The crown, as you can see, has little curlicues, little scrolls on the arches, whereas the crown on the right underneath the lion crest is clearly modelled on an English royal crown, and this difference pertains to this day. They are both imperial crowns. They are closed with arches, but they are different in type, both being to an extent based on a real crown. The crown of Scotland and the imperial crown, the St Edward's crown of England, still very much exist. The arms in the middle are taken from his great seal as King of Scots, and as you can see have curlicues or scrolls on the arches. You will also note that the arms are surrounded by two collars, the collar of the Order of the Thistle, which was not established formally with statutes until 100 years later, and the collar of the Order of the Garter. By the time of the Union of Parliaments in 1707, 100 years after the Union of the Crowns, the royal arms included a somewhat odd hybrid mixture of crowns. The crown on which the lion sits in the crest is clearly a Scottish crown. The one on his head is clearly an English crown. However, as recently as 1882, a very strange crown appeared on the Mercat Cross in Edinburgh. I have never been sure whether this was a carving by a stonemason with little confidence in his own work, or whether he was trying to be medieval in concept. The great armorial of Sir David Lindsay of the Mount, Lord Lion, King of Arms, is one of our great treasures in Scotland. He produced a massive armorial, starting with the royal houses, royal houses of Europe, and went through right to the ordinary armigerous but non-noble individual. We can see, however, that he did not distinguish between the ranks of nobility in his crowns, And the slide on the image on the left shows both the heir to the throne, the Duke of Rossi, the arms with the blue three-point label, but also the arms of a non-royal duke on the bottom right, and they all have the same coronet. And when you move to earls, they all have a very simple circlet, nothing like what we would nowadays think of as a ducal coronet. The family of the House of Hamilton, particularly Regent Arran, who was regent during the minority of Mary Queen of Scots, used arms which have a very strong political motivation. The family was next in line to succeed to the throne, and indeed thought they should be on the throne. And you will see that the slide on the left and the one in the middle both show an imperial crown applicable to the heir to the throne, in that it has a single arch rather than a double arch. But they are clearly here showing what they held to be their royal status as heirs to the throne. A little later, they desisted from that claim and ended up with a coronet very much more reminiscent of the simple one we saw in the previous slide. I must make one point here, that where I use the word baron on the images, I do not mean a baron as known in Scotland. Barons in Scotland are not peers. They are not one of the ranks of the peerage of Scotland. In Scotland, we would call a baron a Lord of Parliament. And the slide that Lewis showed earlier of the Scottish heraldry showed the arms of these non-noble barons. Their status has changed considerably over the centuries, but they now are not regarded as part of the nobility. The coronets used were by no means consistent at this period at all. In the mid-16th century armorial, the arms on the left of the Earl of Eglinton show what we would now think of as a viscount's coronet, although the number of pearls is wrong. Even though both these drawings show a lack of finesse, they are very good examples of the heraldry of the time. You will note that the arms on the right for Lord Drummond show no coronet at all. He was a Lord of Parliament, the lowest of the ranks of the peerage of Scotland, and we shall see why he had no coronet shortly. These four images are taken from an armorial known as Kings and Nobilities' arms, and there are therefore no entries for commoners therein. As you'll see, there's a much closer distinction in the coronets to those that we now use today. These coats are interesting for other reasons. The arms on the extreme left are those of the Duke of Lennox, a noble family with royal descent. And you'll see that the inner scutcheon in the middle of the shield, the saltire with roses, is an inner scutcheon for his territorial earldom rather than for his name. The second coat for the Earl of Stirling is interesting. The Earl of Stirling was charged by King James to colonize Nova Scotia as a means of bringing money to the crown, and handed out tracts of lands to people who became baronets or hereditary knights. And his arms show on the inner scutcheon the arms of Nova Scotia, which all Nova Scotian baronets can use to this day. The Viscount's Haddington arms are unusual in Scottish heraldry in that they are an impaled coat, but do not show the arms of husband and wife. The arms on the dexter relate to an incident known as the Gowrie Conspiracy, when a young Ramsay, John Ramsay, dealt a blow to save the king and was granted an augmentation of a sword and hand bearing on it the crown of Scotland. The arms of Lord Ochiltree on the extreme right show his natural descent from a son of the Duke of Albany, and no one was completely upset by having a border compony on their arms. An armorial by the Lord Lyon Lindsay of Rathellet of the 1570s shows the arms of Mary Queen of Scots impaled with those of her second husband, Lord Darnley. Lord Darnley himself was a very close heir to the Scottish throne, and he was somewhat annoyed that Mary Queen of Scots would not make him king. And you can see here the armorial shows again the crown of an heir apparent with one arch, which was the position in which he deemed himself to be. It is also unusual in that the arms are shown as a normal husband and wife impalement, rather than what one might have expected, a royal impalement with the arms of the royal spouse on the sinister. This is a very finely executed armorial of about 1600, where each set of arms is surmounted by the relevant coronet. And you will see that although close to what one might now think of modern ducal coronets, they are simplified. The ducal coronet doesn't have enough strawberry leaves. The leaves on the Earl's coronet have disappeared, and the coronet for the Viscount and the Lord of Parliament show the wrong number of pearls. But the Lord of Parliament does now have a coronet, which he did not before. The style of noble crowns and coronets was not laid down finally until a warrant of just the very early years of the 20th century. As you will see here, the description on the left is that given by Sir George Mackenzie of Rose Hall in 1680, who wrote very succinctly on heraldry throughout Europe. And you will see the eagle eye that he talks about the arms of the crowns of the Empire of Germany and of France. The image on the right shows the warrant of October 1901, which set down in perpetuity the types of coronets to be used by the nobility in the United Kingdom. Oh, how do I go back? Anterior. This is a particularly lovely set of playing cards, with each suit showing the arms of various nobles in Scotland. This particular suit of hearts does not have a Viscount's card, a card for a Viscount. Viscounts are fairly few and far between in Scotland, and clearly they couldn't find one to be in this particular suit. So you see the arms of the King of Scotland for the King, the arms of the Hamiltons, the heirs, for the Queen, and then you go through the lower ranks for a Duke, for a Prince, an Earl with 3 shields, a Lord with 4 shields, and interestingly, the arms of Sir Alexander Erskine of Cambeau, who was a very famous Lord Lyon of the period, and he and all Lyons have a right to a version of the Crown of Scotland, which is enamelled but not jewelled. So you see there a representation of the arms of the Crown of Scotland. This slide comes from a series of works known as funeral escutcheons, and they're essentially jottings of pedigrees that were prepared so that when a funeral escutcheon, which we shall see in the next slide, was prepared, the artist would know which arms to paint on the funeral escutcheon. And thus you'll see the arms are very, very simple, the shield tricked, no colour, merely an indication of colour, but the relevant coronet was important because that the artist would need to know. And most heraldic artists of the period were probably what we would call jobbing artists. They weren't very specialised, and wouldn't have known what an earl's coronet was unless they had an image to work from. While these are literally just little pencil jottings, they are remarkably useful for the genealogist, and I've used this series of about 8 books regularly, including last week, when an Earl of Weems wanted to know when the arms of his ancestor acquired a double treasure. This is the result of those jottings. Lord Douglas of Douglas, who died in 1827, is a mysterious man, or his background is mysterious. His parents, who were childless, went to France, and at the age of 50, his mother, who was married to a man of 63, neither of them had had any children, produced twins. There was much story at the time that 2 women in Paris were known to have given up their sons just as these twins appeared, and the thought was that the twins, of course, were nothing to do with the 50-year-old mother or the 63-year-old father. However, they brought a case, and Parliament decreed that he was indeed the son of the 50-year-old woman. When he died, it was very important to establish that he really was Lord Douglas of Douglas. And this fine funeral hatchment was produced with the arms of all his ancestors. There are, unfortunately, a number of fairly serious errors on the arms, but the names are right, that heraldry is wrong. In Scotland, as is the case in Spain, women can succeed to peerages, and there are a number of peerages which descend to and through women. Indeed, there is one Scottish peerage which is now held by an Italian, having descended through several generations of women who have married into foreign families. This is, however, an unusual representation of the arms of a female peeress, the Duchess of Buccleuch on the left. It just happened that she was in right of the peerage at the time this armorial was printed. She succeeded in 1661 and did not die until 1732, and thus became very well known within the peerage of Scotland. Relatively few Scottish armorials show a canopy or canopy of maintenance around the arms. But you will see in both these that the arms are ensigned by a coronet of rank for the Duchess, and next door to her geographically close neighbour, the Marquis of Roxburgh. Some blank, sorry. These arms are taken from a late 17th century armorial. I emphasize again that the Baron is a Lord of Parliament, the lowest tier of the nobility. And you will see here that these are very well executed coats of arms, by then done on blank templates. We have a number of armorials where the template is the same, the artistic style is different. We can date this armorial almost exactly in that the arms on the left relate to Hay, Earl of Tweedale. It's clearly an earl's coronet above his arms. He's clearly an earl. But in 1694, he was raised to the rank of Marquis. So this armorial was probably started around 1692 and completed about 1695. The arms in the middle relate to the Viscount of Oxford. This Viscount died, the man whose arms are shown here, died in 1705, and the honours were not revived until 1977, 270 odd years. that could no longer happen. But I remember the case very well indeed, and it was fascinating how the then Lord Oxford was able to show his right to the peerages. The coat on the extreme right is that of Lord Fraser of Lovat. There are two Fraser peerages, that of Saltoun and that of Fraser of Lovat. This is an interesting case in that there was a dispute as to whether it should be the heir of line, the female, who would succeed, or the heir male. As it turned out, the heir male did succeed, but he was a devout Jacobite and lost his head for high treason in 1747. From all accounts, he was not a very nice man, but he lost his head because of politics, not because of his rather despicable character. Yep. By the 18th century, peerage reference works were becoming well known and they were engraved, and this is an example from 1764 with very clear coronets for dukes shown thereon. As they became more common, they became grander and grander. In the middle is a 1722 engraving, but the engravings on either side are much later, from about 160 years later, and you'll see here the arms with a very large coronet on the left. The coronet's not so obvious on the right because of the helmet and crest. The arms of Queensberry, the Duke of Queensberry, with noble arms around the side. This became a very, very popular way of showing the arms of nobles and to ensure their illustrious connections were given. This is an interesting example. These are the arms of the widowed Marchioness of Lansdowne. Her husband was the Marquis, and as you will see, the arms are ensigned of a very large Marquis's coronet. But in the middle are her arms in her own right as Baroness Nairn, and these are ensigned with a Lord of Parliament's coronet. So an interesting example of somebody in right of two coronets at the same time on their arms, one for themselves and one for their husband. These are modern examples taken from the Public Register of all arms and bearings in Scotland. But you'll see coronets here are given quite a prominent place. Interestingly, the arms for the Marquis of Linlithgow on the left show a circlet for the Order of the Thistle. No such circlet exists, and this is, I'm afraid, I would like to say an artist's mistake, but I fear may have been a mistake of the heraldic draftsman of the time, and the arms of Earl Balfour, who was Prime Minister. These are a selection of book plates of nobles where the crowns or coronets are each treated as important. The one on the top right is an interesting example of a double coronet. These is the cipher of Princess Louise, the daughter of Queen Victoria, who became Marchioness of Lorne. And so she has above her cipher her princess's coronet, and in the middle, the coronet of the wife of a marquis. And that is a brief account of the coronets of Scotland. Thank you very much.
Any question?
I have two questions. First of all, in the case of Lord Darnley, why are his arms on a lozenge?
Because they are the arms of the Queen, really.
So he's not even allowed to be a man on this occasion?
I think there's some dispute as to how manly he was. No, it's because that's the sort of, I suppose, the sop to the fact that he is only able to show them in that way because he is married to the Queen.
And my second question is, in the case of the Duchess of Buccleuch's arms, the mantle that surrounds them, might that assumption be the fact that her husband had claimed the throne and had some royal protections, a sort of leftover from from that pretension. And of course, he'd lost his head; he'd been executed. But
well, that was of the time, wasn't it? It's possible, yes. They are fairly. If you look at this one, she has her arms with a mantle around them. Yes, it is quite possible. But then that particular armorial, all the engravings, all the arms have mantles on them. I'm trying to get back to it, but I think there's another one on the same. See this one, the Marqués, Earl of Gifford, as he was at that stage. He has a mantling around it, and I don't think there's any suggestion there was a royal connection there. So I think it's merely taste of the time.
May I ask a question, ma'am?
Of course.
It's just a generic question, but in Portugal, the royal crown only adopts the inner lining in red velvet after the marriage of Queen Catherine of Braganza. Queen Catherine of Braganza brings that tradition from England. And from what I've researched in Portugal, the tradition, according to the Portuguese usage of the lined crown with crimson velvet, it originates from the fact that the kings that were considered most faithful monarchs were given a ducal, pontifical ducal, or cardinal cap, which they wore on ecclesiastical occasions. The Portuguese received that also with King Manuel and his embassy that took an elephant in the 1500s to Pope Leo's court. This pontifical ducal cap, which was a red velvet cap. And from what I researched in Portugal and the usage of this, it says that the origin comes from the fact that a king of England was bald. And so the crown, when it sat on his head, was cold, especially in long ceremonies in winter. So then he devised to place the cardinal's cap, which he was entitled to wear and was warm, under the crown, and it became the trend. That is at least the story that I was able to find regarding the importing of that tradition to Portugal, which does not exist before the time of Catherine of Braganza. Do you know if there's any truth to that, or if it's an urban legend?
No, I don't, but certainly earlier representations of royal crowns were open crowns. They didn't get arches until they claimed an imperial background. And I would think that certainly the cap was instituted into the open crown for some specific reason, although not, I suspect, a religious one as such. But, I mean, the king, our king, not the next one, but the one after that, lacks hair, and he might find that very comfortable. I don't know. It's a nice story. I haven't researched it, but I see stranger reasons have been the result of things like that, so it's quite possible.
I don't remember the name of the king,
No,
but I will next time bring it. I don't remember the name, but it is referenced who the king was.
Right. Well, I will look that up and ask my colleagues at the college if they have any.
Please, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. The time is... El problema es que estamos ya con el tiempo sobrepasado. Entonces, una pregunta, pero a short question, please.
A very short question. Est-ce que cette hiérarchie des couronnes était strictement respectée dans la réalité? Oui.
Yes. Oui.
Merci.
Oui.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Elizabeth. Continuamos con la siguiente intervención.